Welcome everybody to episode number 4. Once again, we continue our journey here with Napoleon. He is already deep into Russia, and we're going to see how the situation is going to evolve. In the meantime, in conversation with his generals, Tsar Alexander admitted that he needed to appoint a leader capable of uniting both the army and the people. He acknowledged that the outcome of the war would depend on this decision. One general, suggested by many other generals around him in a meeting, was General Kutuzov. Kutuzov was not well liked by Alexander. The Tsar's dislike was rooted in his personal history with Kutuzov, because Kutuzov's face reminded him of the defeat at Austerlitz, a battle where Kutuzov had offered advice that Alexander had ignored. So there was a little bit of a wounded ego there. Kutuzov was known for his love for food and women. There were even reports that in his quarters, young women dressed as Cossacks were assigned to warm his bed during campaigns. Alexander, being puritanical in nature, found this behavior to be completely at odds with his own values. And this difference in lifestyle led to a clear clash between the two men. However, to lead a war of liberation, a Russian was needed. In the end, Alexander chose Kutuzov to be the next generalissimo, the next head of generals. Upon this appointment, Kutuzov immediately set out to rally his troops by saying, "Comrades," he wrote, "do your duty. Remember the city is burned to the ground, and the children who need your protection. Think of your Emperor Alexander, who sees you as the backbone of his strength." As the Tsar's army reorganized, Napoleon ordered his troops to push beyond their limits, insisting that rest was unworthy of his soldiers. Burning dust clouds whipped up by strong winds made the march even harder from the burning of Smolensk. The rapid pace caused many horses to be lost, and with typhus spreading, Russian propaganda targeted the weakest soldiers by saying, "French soldiers, they make you march against us. They tell you you're fighting for peace. Do not believe their lies. You fight for the insatiable ambition of a master who mocks the blood of the brave. Return home while you still can." Using desertion appeals, guerrilla tactics, and psychological warfare, the Russians aimed to weaken the Grande Armée and create openings for attacks. In just 2 months, Napoleon's army was greatly reduced by illness, casualties, injuries, and desertions. Entire units had been left behind to guard Vilnius and Smolensk. Despite these losses, the French continued their relentless advance. Cavalry and infantry moved day and night, chasing the elusive Russian army. To Caulaincourt, the war was beginning to feel pointless, and he said, "We destroy each other only to gain ground, but at what cost as we continue to gain ground?" Moscow was now only 3 days away, with the pressure mounting away, because it was something that they were looking forward to reach. Moscow itself was this end goal. And Kutuzov decided to stop Napoleon at Borodino, 125 kilometers from the city. The rugged terrain, filled with ravines and dense trees, would slow the enemy's progress. Kutuzov placed his defensive line along the southern bank of the Kolotsia River, blocking the road to Moscow. He set up 4 redoubts, the largest, the Raevsky Redoubt, along with 2 smaller ones, the Bagration and the Sheverdinos redoubts, which formed the front line. A redoubt is an earthwork fortification built on elevated ground, where cannons are arranged in batteries. Below, trenches were filled with soldiers, and behind, the main Russian forces were positioned. Kutuzov believed his defensive setup was strong, protected by the river and the network of redoubts. Napoleon commands an army of 140,000 men, facing off against Kutuzov's with 110,000 men. The French forces consist of 214 infantry battalions, 317 cavalry squadrons, and 587 artillery pieces. When the cannon fire begins, the French feel a strange sense of relief. It means the Russians haven't disappeared this time. The two armies focus on their fight on two strategic points: the village of Borodino, which lies on the road to Moscow, and the Shevardino Redoubt, a crucial part of the Russian defense. In less than 2 hours, over 10,000 men are killed or wounded in what is just a prelude to the main battle. This first attack lets the French test the Russians' resolve. Even the wounded refuse to surrender, determined to stand their ground. Despite their bravery, the French succeed in capturing the Shevardino Redoubt, though they suffer heavy losses. The first phase of Napoleon's plan had succeeded. As both sides tend to their wounded, the Russians reinforce their defenses, focusing on the Raevsky and Bagration redoubts. Kutuzov organizes a procession carrying the icon of the Virgin of Smolensk, rallying his troops with a call to fight for God, the Tsar, and Holy Russia. Never have the Russians prayed with such fervor as they do today, writes the poet Glick. In these hours, our hearts and soul converse in the secret with the divine. While the Russians put their faith in God, the Grande Armée places its faith in Napoleon, eagerly preparing for the next day. It is September the 7th at Borodino. Napoleon has had little sleep, going to bed at 3 a.m., worried that the Russians might disappear again. But when he steps out of his tent at dawn, the sight of the rising sun brings him renewed confidence, reminding him of the victory at Austerlitz. The night before, he refined his battle plan. He will focus on breaking through the Russian southern flank and capturing their stronghold, the Raevsky Redoubt, and the Imperial Guard will stay in reserve, ready to act if needed. Soldiers, here is the battle you long desired. Victory depends on you. It is essential for us. It will bring you abundance, comfortable barracks, and a swift return home. Fight as you did at Austerlitz, and let future generations take pride in your conduct. Let it be said of you, he was there. For 10 hours, the armies clash fiercely. Fear fades amid the chaos of bullets, cannon fire, and grenades. Soldiers hardly notice their comrades falling beside them, struck down in the heat of battle. The Russians will call it the Battle of Borodino, while the French will refer to it as the Battle of the Moskva. Positions are captured, lost, recaptured, and lost again as the battle rages on. General Montbrand, 2nd Cavalry Corps, is tasked with charging to the right of the Raevsky Redoubt. Montbrand sets out on horseback to scout the ideal position for the attack, but tragically a cannonball strikes him in the chest. Napoleon quickly replaces him with Auguste de Caulaincourt, the brother of Armand de Caulaincourt. The Russian infantry, shaken by the mortal wounding of General Bagration, regains its composure and intensifies its efforts to reclaim lost ground. The battle becomes a hellish scene, with the sky burning and cannons unleashing death in an apocalyptic display. Caulaincourt has a terrible premonition. At 3 p.m., his brother Auguste, leading the 5th Heavy Cavalry Regiment, and supported by 2 divisions and 2 infantry battalions, charges the Raevsky Redoubt. The Russians are forced to retreat. The wounded, suffering terribly, beg to be killed to end their pain. Though the Russians abandoned their positions, their army is not yet destroyed. The battle, fierce and brutal, leaves no clear victor. There must be a loser, but the outcome remains unclear. Assessing the results of the Battle of Borodino is difficult because Napoleon and Kutuzov had different objectives. Napoleon aimed to completely defeat the Russian army, while Kutuzov's goal was to block the French and protect Moscow. In that era, the winner of a battle was the army that remained in control of the battlefield. In the Battle of Borodino, the Russians retreat and the French army maintains control of the ground. Therefore, Napoleon is considered to be the victor of the Battle of Borodino. While Napoleon's forces technically won the Battle of Borodino, the battle ultimately weakened the Grande Armée significantly, which is why the Russians consider it a victory. It's fair to say the French won the Battle of Borodino, but the Russians did not lose the same battle. So it is something that neither both of them wanted to. There was not a clear-cut victory at the end. And for Napoleon, it was a hollow victory. The cost in lives was enormous, but he had kept the Imperial Guard, the elite of the Grande Armée, in reserve. Perhaps too cautiously. Had he committed the Guard to the fight, the victory might have been more decisive, and many lives could have been saved. Caulaincourt could never forget that day. His brother Auguste had told him before leading to the charge of the Rajeski redoubt, "We will triumph, or I'll be killed." After the battle, Caulaincourt had lost not only his brother, but his best friend at just 35 years old. By the end of the battle, the toll was staggering. Over 120,000 cannonballs and 300,000 cartridges had been fired. The Russians suffered 45,000 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, more than a third of their army. Napoleon's losses were also heavy, with 28,000 men killed or wounded. The battle exposed the poor state of medical care, as many wounded soldiers were left on the battlefield without help. The Grande Armée had only one doctor and one pharmacist for every 600 soldiers, and just 45 surgeons worked tirelessly to treat casualties from both sides. Some leg amputations were performed in under 4 minutes. 10,000 wounded soldiers were beyond saving, and they were left in nearby villages where most would die. Napoleon had planned to resume the battle the following day, but Kutuzov had a different idea. Why didn't he continue the fight as promised? After the battle, Kutuzov initially ordered an attack on the French, but the next day, but by nightfall, he changed his mind and ordered a retreat. The most likely reason was that he had received reports of the devastating losses suffered by his army, which were far worse than expected. Kutuzov, reflecting on the situation with his generals, concluded that his troops were no longer capable of blocking Napoleon's advance. It was better to preserve them for another day rather than risk another battle. 3 months earlier, 420,000 soldiers had crossed the Niemen River, but now only half of them remained. And we're talking about the Grande Armée from Napoleon's side. These soldiers had come from France, Spain, and Italy, traveling more than 4,000 kilometers, crossing the Alps, the Pyrenees, Germany, Poland, and Western Russia. They were exhausted and hoped for rest. Napoleon's campaign in Russia had reached its high point with the occupation of Moscow. The French emperor believed that his greatest triumph was at hand, that Tsar Alexander would be forced to negotiate peace as others had done before him. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent victory, the foundations of disaster were already forming. Moscow, a city in flames, offered no spoils of war, no capitulation, and no clear path forward. The Russian winter loomed, and the Tsar's refusal to yield signaled a shift in the nature of the conflict. As Napoleon settled into the Kremlin, his soldiers faced the chaos of looting, dwindling supplies, and the growing menace of Russian partisans. The dream of a swift and decisive campaign was unraveling. Tsar Alexander's silence was not the pause before a surrender. It was the calm before a storm that would engulf the Grande Armée. For Napoleon, the decision to stay or retreat would define not only the campaign, but his legacy, as victory turned into the shadow of an impending defeat. the stage was set for the Grande Armée's most harrowing ordeal yet, the long and bitter retreat from Moscow. We're starting to see the limits of the Grande Armée. The men are tired. Maybe they're being pushed too far. They're demotivated. And many of his leaders have been killed. So there is some anxiety and fear. And also you have desertion and the countless wounded in the field. As you can see, like one doctor for 600 men, that is a bit of a stretch, and therefore you don't have the logistical support actually to continue. But what we'll see later, we'll see a Napoleon that will almost be delusional in a sense that he needs to reach his objective no matter what. It's a personal thing for him to reach Moscow and actually to go on with his victory. And he alludes to the fact that once he reaches Moscow, Alexander will just capitulate and hand him over the keys of the city and say, there you go, you've done it, you're the winner. And we'll find out that it's really not going to turn out the way Napoleon is going to wish. We will find out next time.